Welcome to this rapid revision video for the Whitechapel unit. This is the second of two videos looking at the Jack the Ripper murders. In this one, we'll be looking at the investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders, considering what methods were used, how effective they were, and why ultimately the police failed to unmask Jack the Ripper. This is going to be much more detailed and longer than the last one, although I have kept it as brief as I can. After all, it is supposed to be rapid revision. So let's get into it. Firstly, a brief reminder about the Whitechapel murders, which I covered in more detail in the previous video in this series. In 1888, 5 women were murdered in Whitechapel. Mary Ann Nichols was found in Bucks Row on the 31st of August. The second, Annie Chapman, was found in the backyard of number 29 Hanbury Street, Spitalfields, on the 8th of September. Elizabeth Stride was found in Berners Street on the 30th of September, and just 45 minutes later, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, Aldgate. Mary Jane Kelly was found inside 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street, Spitalfields, on the 9th of November. These women are the so-called canonical 5, most associated with the Jack the Ripper case, but violence and murders of women in Whitechapel were sadly not rare. The police believe that all 5 women were the victims of the same murderer. The murderer has never been identified, but has been given the popular name Jack the Ripper. While unsuccessful, the methods used by the police provide examples of the challenges of detective work in the late 19th century, and that's what we're going to spend this video having a look at. So what investigative techniques were employed by the Met? One was following up on direct clues and leads, which might be obvious, but they also arranged post-mortem examinations of the victims, which were conducted very scientifically. They also followed up on theories of journalists, including possible letters from the killer. They also followed up on clues found with the victims or nearby. They visited lunatic asylums too, believing that the killer had to be insane. They followed up on coroners' reports as well. They interviewed what few witnesses they could find, and in order to find them, they set up soup kitchens to gather evidence from potential witnesses who came forward. In the next part of the video, we're going to consider each of these investigative techniques in turn. Why didn't they work? Various methods were used from the moment Mary Ann Nichols' body was discovered. How did the Met try to use each technique to advance the case? Firstly, they followed up on direct leads. Initially, there was a suggestion that the murders were related to gang violence and theft from sex workers, but this was quickly dismissed. They also used evidence from post-mortems. Rhys Llewellyn performed detailed examinations of the victims' bodies. He suggested that the cut marks indicated a left-handed killer, and that they may have had some surgical or anatomical knowledge. This pointed investigators towards slaughterhouses and hospitals in search of clues. Journalist theories were also put to the test. A journalist from the Manchester Guardian suggested that a local Jewish man, John Pizer, nicknamed Leather Apron, might be to blame. However, he had solid alibis explaining his whereabouts for both Nichols and Chapman's murders, so he could be discounted. Nevertheless, they still have put up posters like the one I've just shown. Clues found with the victims were also used, but to no avail. An envelope found near Annie Chapman's body contained a seal of the Sussex Regiment. However, investigators soon found that such seals were easy to obtain locally and could not help identify a culprit. Rings had been taken from her fingers, but these did not turn up in local jewellers' or pawnbrokers' shops, so probably they were not the motive. The police also visited lunatic asylums. The savagery of the murders led investigators to believe that the killer must be insane. They visited psychiatric hospitals, which were then called lunatic asylums, in search of clues, but they found none. They also followed up on coroners' reports. Dr. Wynne Baxter suggested that the murderer may have had special skills and specific motives. This is part of what he wrote. This is from the report of Dr. Wynne Baxter into the murder of Annie Chapman. This was written on the 14th of September 1888. The injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. The organ, which in this case referred to Chapman's womb, had been taken by one who knew where to find it. No unskilled person could have known this, or have recognised it when found. For instance, no mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room with a desire to possess the missing organ. This would seem to suggest that perhaps a surgeon or a doctor or someone else with experience performed the murders, but this could have been a really false lead. The theory was later challenged by detectives. This was written by Chief Inspector Swanson, in his report into the murder of Catherine Eddowes. This was written on the 6th of November 1888, a few months later. There is no evidence of anatomical knowledge that suggested the killer was a qualified surgeon. Otherwise, the police could have narrowed their inquiries down to certain classes of persons. On the other hand, as in the Metropolitan Police cases, the medical evidence showed that the murderer could have been committed by a hunter, a butcher, a slaughterman, as well as a student in surgery or a properly qualified surgeon. And so you can see that Swanson doesn't believe that the killer needed to be skilled. Interviewing key witnesses was very difficult. There were very few people who claimed to be eyewitnesses to any of the events immediately before or after the murders. However, one Elizabeth Long claimed to have seen a man talking to Annie Chapman a few minutes before her body was discovered. Police ignored this evidence as it did not match the doctor's estimates about the time of death. This wasn't helped by the fact that many of the potential witnesses didn't speak any English, and the English police officers didn't speak the languages of the immigrant communities. Soup kitchens were set up, though, to try and get more witnesses. Cash rewards were forbidden for fear of attracting time wasters and liars from Whitechapel's residents. However, many of the poor were attracted by the promise of free food, especially a hot meal. They could then be questioned for information. Following up on these methods, for a time detectives showed an interest in slaughterhouses and veterinary surgeons, until the attack on Eddowes cast doubt on the surgical skill of the killer. Nevertheless, 76 slaughtermen and butchers were questioned as witnesses. The police had clearly tried a lot of different techniques and got nowhere. This led to a lot of public criticism. Criticism came to a head after the murders of both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were discovered on the night of the 30th September, only a few minutes apart, in the so-called double event. Chief Inspector Swanson decided to respond by making public some of the techniques employed by the police to show how hard they were working and the fact that they were trying to be innovative. There were house-to-house searches and over 2,000 lodging house residents had been questioned. 80,000 handbills like the one pictured was given out appealing for information. And working with neighbouring divisions of the Met, including the Thames River Police who questioned sailors, was also tried. Criticism continued in the press, which continued to publish misleading theories in search of sales, and often resorted to crude anti-Semitic stereotypes and claims that the murderer was foreign, a distraction from the main efforts of investigators. This famous cartoon by the magazine Punch is called Blind Man's Buff. It shows a lot of different residents of Whitechapel, some of whom are quite stereotypically depicted as immigrants, avoiding very easily a policeman who is blindfolded and helpless. Some criticism of the police might seem quite unfair to us today, but there were avoidable blunders too. Police employed the services of two bloodhound sniffer dogs, Barnaby and Burgo, to help track down the killer, but their owner was not paid and he withdrew them. Truthfully, with the techniques at their disposal, the best that H Division could probably hope for and CID was to try and catch Jack the Ripper in the act. Dedicated officers adopted rubber soles to creep up on suspects. Inspector Aberlin himself wrote of patrolling the district until 4 or 5 in the morning, my eyes wide open for clues. This was while he was off duty, remember. And then giving those wretched homeless women 4p or 6p for a shelter to get them away from the streets and out of harm's way. If this testimony can be believed, and it probably can be, this shows that Aberlin really did care about solving the case and felt dreadful that they hadn't caught Jack the Ripper yet. Some tried to trap the Ripper by impersonating prostitutes in disguise, though their dedication did not extend to shaving their moustaches, which rather spoiled the effect. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren came in for special criticism, which would eventually result in his dismissal. Here we can see an article in the East London Advertiser, dated the 15th of September 1888. This was based upon Warren's decision to bring soldiers in to help the police in Whitechapel. After all, he was a military man and this had been his method before. The double stupidity of weakening his detective force and strengthening his ordinary force from reserves of the military destroys two safeguards of a community. It deprives it of a specially trained force of men with brain power specially adapted for detective work, and it takes away the old community constable to be replaced by a man with a few years military service but no other qualification for serving the public. Nothing has indeed been more characteristic of the hunt for the Whitechapel murderer than the lack of local knowledge displayed by the police. They seem to know little of the dark alleyways of the neighbourhood and still less of the bad characters who swarm through them. So why did the police fail? H Division and CID lacked virtually all modern forensic techniques. A collection of photographic mugshots had begun to be compiled at Scotland Yard, but it was yet to be big enough to be of much use. Fingerprinting criminals and crime scenes was still 12 years away. DNA evidence, which would have been tremendously helpful, was 100 years away, the first conviction being secured in 1988, exactly a century later. Doctors could not yet tell the difference between animal and human blood, much less identify blood groups. Crime scene photography was beginning to be used, for example at the murder scene of Mary Jane Kelly, but its use was not yet refined. This is the image here, which of course for understandable reasons I've blurred. Other than catching Jack the Ripper in the act, there was little that H Division or CID could do. With the lack of progress in police inquiries, some people decided to take the law into their own hands. A Vigilance Committee is a group of people who try to deal with criminals in their own way without going through the official authorities. This is quite literally a Wild West idea, which was pretty common on the American frontier about 20 or 30 years earlier. Vigilance committees try and track down criminals, and they'll often put them on trial and try and mete out justice themselves. Local traders and businessmen were frustrated by the police refusal to offer reward money for useful information and the general lack of progress with their inquiries. They set up the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee on the 10th of September 1888. The 300 false letters perhaps support the Met's decision not to risk attracting time wasters with cash rewards, and this was certainly the view of Home Secretary Henry Matthews. However, the Vigilance Committee organised their own measures. They arranged their own reward money. They patrolled the streets with burning planks of wood, whistles and heavy boots, making as much noise as possible, which seems fairly counterproductive when you consider the next thing. They tried to catch the murderer in the act, despite the obvious warning that their noisy patrols provided. Perhaps most surprisingly of all, they encouraged the sensationalist reporting. Some even sent false leads to CID and to the newspapers for publication. So what made the Vigilance Committee resort to such obviously counterproductive methods? Well, there are a couple of theories. There is some suggestion that the Vigilance Committee were in fact made up of Socialist Democratic Federation supporters who wanted to make the police look stupid, improving the party's chances in the upcoming London County Council elections. Perhaps they reflected the wider frustrations and mistrust that local people had for the police. But whatever happens, the Vigilance Committee did not help find the killer. After the Met's very public failure to track down Jack the Ripper, hopefully lessons were learned and improvements were made. Well, in fairness, quite a few were. The first we're going to consider is the Bertillon system. French police officer Alphonse Bertillon developed a system for accurately recording and identifying criminals. It combined physical measurements with photography and record keeping, called the Bertillon system or anthropometry. Such details could in theory only ever apply to one person and could therefore be used to catch repeat criminals. You can see a diagram from Bertillon's book here which shows the different measurements taken by these different people. The Met adopted the Bertillon system in 1894, but there are few examples of its successful use before being superseded by the fingerprint recording system. Bertillon's photographic methods, however, remain in use to this day. They really did work. Improvements were also made to communication. In 1888, the policeman's whistle was the only way that they could communicate over any distance, but by 1900 police forces were making increasing use of telephones, which was a big leap forward. Compared to Glasgow's police force, though, which introduced police call boxes in 1891, the Met were slow adopters of the technology. It wasn't until 1901 that H Division HQ could call Met headquarters, and 1907 when they had a telephone exchange all of their own. This is a picture of a Glasgow police call box. The way they worked is that the police would be alerted that there was a call coming in, and they would run to one of these easily accessible police call boxes, pick up the phone and get their instructions before being dispatched. This is the forerunner to portable radios. And yes, I know what you're probably thinking. This does look rather like Doctor Who's TARDIS. Well, there's a reason for that. When Doctor Who first came out in the 1960s, such police call boxes were very common features in lots of British cities. That meant there was an idea that Doctor Who could land his spaceship, which looked like one of these police boxes, on the corner of a street and no one would pay it any attention. Of course, it doesn't really work today when there are very few of them still on the streets. Anyway, I digress somewhat. The Met also adopted bicycles in 1909, though Kent and other rural forces have been adopting them as a means of transport since 1896. So yet again, the Met are showing that they're a bit slow here. The public outrage surrounding the Whitechapel murders seems to have actually done little to improve detection rates until the invention of more modern forensic techniques. Probably with modern techniques, Jack the Ripper would have been quickly caught and maybe some of the murders would have been prevented. But these things simply didn't exist, and the circumstances too were against H Division and CID in Whitechapel. Lessons were also learned about the environment. The Whitechapel murders helped people to understand the links between living conditions and crime. It began to be understood that it was less about supposed character defects of the poor and more a consequence of poverty, discontent and poor health. There were two changes to the law. Firstly, the Houses of the Working Classes Act passed in 1890. This began the process of allowing the London County Council to develop schemes to replace the slums with affordable accommodation, much like the Peabody Estate in Whitechapel. And then there was the Public Health Amendment Act of 1890, which was a development of the earlier Public Health Acts of 1848 and 1875. These improved council powers to deal with toilets, sewers, paving, rubbish collection and other problems that reduced the quality of life of residents. Sadly, despite all this, violence and murders against vulnerable women continued. Hooligan youths even deliberately terrorised women by impersonating Jack the Ripper. Police records show that burglaries actually increased after the murders. Perhaps the police were distracted by their attempts to catch Jack the Ripper. Attempts that, of course, sadly, were in vain. Let's sum up our final points then. The police used a variety of methods to try and find Jack the Ripper. All failed. Following direct and indirect leads, looking for clues at the scene, post-mortem examinations, investigating journalist theories, interviewing witnesses, visiting asylums and setting up soup kitchens were all attempted, and none of them worked. Some coroners' reports suggested Jack the Ripper had surgical skill, but later evidence went against this. This meant that detectives were often chasing in different directions. Few suspects were identified. One, Leather Apron, turned out to be innocent of the murders. Lack of progress undermined public trust in the police, who tried to show that they were doing all that they could. However, there were avoidable mistakes too, such as failing to make effective use of the bloodhounds, bringing in the military and relying too much on the sensationalist reports of the press and the penny dreadfuls. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee claimed to be trying to catch the killer themselves, but in reality they did much to undermine police efforts. CID lacked all the modern forensic techniques used to solve murders. However, some lessons were learned. Improved photography and record keeping under the Bertillon system was adopted, communications by telephone and bicycles slowly improved, and some improvements to living conditions were made. However, Jack the Ripper was never identified or caught. Violence against women, sadly, continued. That's the end of this rapid revision video, and indeed the end of the Whitechapel unit, at least as it comes to content. And that also means, of course, that it's the end of the entire Crime and Punishment Through Time series. My word, it has been a bit of a marathon to get here, and I don't mind saying that, but we are here now. I hope that this video, and indeed the whole series, has been tremendously useful to you. If you want to thank me for my efforts, the best thing you can do is to like the video, maybe make a comment, or subscribe to the channel. That way, more people are likely to see it. Thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.